Most people would have kept their heads down and swallowed the insult, but most people hadn't lost everything like I had. When Vincent Robert left a measly $2 on a $6,000 tab, he wasn't just being cheap, he was trying to see if I had a price. The air in the bistro turned to ice the moment he walked in. Vincent looked less like a businessman and more like a predator in a tailored charcoal suit, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. I had spent the night providing flawless service, masking the desperation of my family's failing bookstore behind a professional smile. But then I saw it, 2 crumpled $1 bills sitting on the silver tray like a slap in the face. My manager hissed at me to let it go, warning me that men like Vincent Robert didn't just break hearts, they broke lives. I didn't listen. I chased him into the pouring New York rain, catching him just as his obsidian motorcade door opened. I shoved the $2 into his silk breast pocket, the heat of my anger clashing with the cold rain. "Keep it," I told him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "You clearly need the charity more than I do." He didn't yell. He just looked at me with a terrifying, slow-burning curiosity that told me everything had just changed. The rain was an unrelenting deluge, the kind of New York downpour that turned the city into a series of blurred, gray watercolor paintings. I stood there on the slick pavement, my lungs burning as I watched the heavy door of the Lyric latch shut with a sound like a guillotine. The obsidian finish of the car was so polished it reflected my own bedraggled state back at me, a woman whose uniform was ruined, whose life was precarious, and who had just insulted the most powerful man in the tri-state area. I didn't care. The adrenaline was a hot, electric current humming in my veins, drowning out the cold. I watched the tinted window slide down with a silent, mechanical precision. Vincent Robert didn't look angry. He looked as though he had just discovered a new species of insect and was deciding whether to study it or crush it under his heel. His eyes, a shade of gray so cold they looked metallic, scanned my face, lingering on the way my hair clung to my cheeks. He didn't say a word, but the silence was heavy, vibrating with an unspoken threat that made the hair on my arms stand up. I turned my back on him before he could respond, walking back toward the warm, golden light of the bistro, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I had just crossed a line I could never step back over. The fallout was swifter and more brutal than I had anticipated. By the time I walked through the service entrance, the air in the kitchen had shifted. The usual clatter of pans and the shouting of orders had been replaced by a suffocating hush. Marcus, my manager, was waiting for me, his face pale and drawn. He didn't even look me in the eye when he told me I was done. He handed me a final envelope of cash, less than I was owed, but more than I expected to get, and told me to leave through the back. By the next morning, the video of our confrontation, captured by a busboy with a penchant for social media, had gone viral. I was the $2 hero, the face of every underpaid worker who had ever wanted to tell a billionaire to go to hell. But fame didn't pay the mortgage on Jersey's rare books. Every phone call I made to other high-end establishments ended the same way, a polite, rehearsed rejection the moment I mentioned my name. Vincent Robert hadn't just fired me, he had erased me. He had turned me into a pariah in the only industry that kept my father's medication in the cabinet and the lights on in our apartment. I spent the next 3 days in the quiet gloom of the bookstore, the smell of old paper and dust acting as a temporary balm for my frayed nerves. My father, Arthur, moved through the stacks like a ghost, his mind drifting further away into the stories he spent his life collecting. He didn't notice the final notice from the bank or the way I skipped meals to make sure he had fresh fruit. He just sat in his leather wingback chair, humming softly to himself as he turned the pages of a first edition Keats. Then, the summons arrived. It wasn't a phone call or a legal threat. It was a black sedan idling at the curb and a man in a suit who looked like he had been carved from granite. He handed me a card for the Robert Gallery with an appointment time that wasn't a request. I went because I had to. I went because I was out of options and because a part of me, a dark, curious part, wanted to see what the predator did when the prey walked into his den of its own volition. The Robert Gallery was a cathedral of glass and steel, a testament to the kind of wealth that could buy silence and respectability in equal measure. Vincent was waiting for me in the center of the main hall, standing before a massive, jagged sculpture that looked like frozen lightning. He didn't apologize for the blacklist or the ruin he had brought to my life. Instead, he offered me a job. He spoke about restructuring and brand management, but his eyes told a different story. He wanted me where he could see me. He wanted to understand why I hadn't broken. I accepted because the salary was a lifeline that would pull my father back from the edge of the abyss. I told myself I could handle it. I told myself I was stronger than whatever game he was playing. I was wrong. The work at the gallery was a descent into a sophisticated underworld I hadn't known existed. As I catalogued the private collections and recovered antiquities, I began to see the patterns. The gallery was a front, a beautifully curated laundry where blood-stained assets were scrubbed clean through high-end auctions and untraceable shell companies. I found myself moving pieces that should have been in national museums, items that carried the weight of history and the stench of conflict. Vincent watched me, always from the periphery, testing my boundaries. One night, in the sterile silence of the vault, we shared a moment of brutal honesty. He told me about his father, a man who had built their empire on the ruins of post-war Europe, and I saw that a monster, for what he truly was, a man who believed that everything in the world, including beauty and people, had a price. I didn't flinch. I looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong. I told him that some things, like the look on my father's face when he remembered my name, couldn't be bought. The tension reached a boiling point during the annual Winter Gala. The gallery was filled with the city's elite, people who traded in influence and ignored the shadows. I had found the hidden ledger by then, the digital proof of every illicit transaction and every crime the Robert name had covered up. I had it on a drive in my pocket, a ticking time bomb. When the Moretti family launched their attack, the gallery turned from a palace to a tomb. The lights failed, the glass shattered, and the air filled with the sharp, metallic tang of gunfire. Vincent didn't run. He moved with a lethal, practiced efficiency, protecting the vault not for the money, but for the secrets it held. I had a choice then. I could hand the ledger to the Morettis and watch Vincent's world burn, or I could stay. I stayed. Not for him, but for the legacy. I saw a way to take the darkness he had created and turn it into something that could actually matter. We fought side by side through the darkened halls, a waitress and a warlord united by a desperate need to survive. In the aftermath, with the gallery in ruins and the authorities closing in, I gave him an ultimatum. We would use his routes, his money, and his power to return every stolen piece to its rightful home. We would turn the Robert Gallery into a global empire of repatriation. It was the only way I would stay. It was the only way I wouldn't turn the drive over to the feds. A year later, the Robert Jersey Foundation was the most respected name in the international art world. My father's bookstore was thriving, a haven for students and scholars, and Arthur Jersey spent his days in a world that finally made sense again. In our shared office, overlooking the bustling streets of a city that had tried to swallow me whole, the two $1 bills sat framed on the wall. They were a reminder of the night I decided I wouldn't be bought. Vincent stood by the window, no longer a predator, but a man who finally understood the value of things he couldn't own. We hadn't just survived the $2 war, we had won a piece that was truly priceless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The silence that followed my firing was not peaceful, it was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air out of our small apartment above the bookstore. For the first 3 days, I existed in a state of suspended animation. I woke up at dawn, my body still tuned to the grueling rhythm of a double shift, only to realize there was nowhere to go. I would sit at the small kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from a cup of tea I didn't want, listening to the muffled sounds of the city waking up outside. Manhattan moved on, indifferent to the fact that I had been erased from its service industry. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped, hoping for a call from one of the dozen restaurants I'd contacted, only to find a notification from a news app or a supportive message from a stranger who had seen the $2 hero video. Support didn't pay the coned bill. By Thursday, the desperation had reached a fever pitch. I walked downstairs into the bookstore, the bell chiming with a hollow, lonely sound. The shop was a labyrinth of towering shelves, a sanctuary of mahogany and the comforting scent of vanilla and old parchment. My father, Arthur, was in his usual spot, his hand trembling slightly as he used a fine bristled brush to clean the spine of a rare folio. He looked up and smiled, but the spark of recognition was dimming. To him, I was still his little girl who had just come home from university, not the woman who was currently calculating how many days of his medication we had left before I had to start selling off the inventory he spent 40 years collecting. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Did we get that shipment of Keats in? I have a feeling today is a day for poetry." "Not yet, Dad," I said, my throat tightening as I forced a smile. "Maybe tomorrow." I retreated to the back desk, pulling out the ledger. The numbers were a battlefield of red ink. We were 48 hours away from the bank's final deadline. I looked at the $2 hero video on my laptop, the millions of views, the thousands of comments calling me brave. It felt like a cruel joke. I wasn't brave, I was unemployed and terrified. The bell above the door chimed again. It wasn't the tentative sound of a browser or the hurried jingle of a delivery man. It was a firm, resonant ring that demanded attention. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway who looked entirely out of place among the dusty classics. He wore a black suit that cost more than my father's entire collection and carried himself with the rigid posture of a soldier. He didn't browse. He walked straight to the counter and laid a heavy, cream-colored envelope on the scarred wood. "Miss Jersey," he said, his voice a flat, practiced monotone. "Mr. Robert would like to discuss the terms of your future. He expects you at the gallery tonight at 8. There will be a car waiting outside at 7:45. "Tell Mr. Robert I'm busy," I snapped, the old fire flickering back to life. The man didn't move. "Mr. Robert doesn't take no for an answer, Miss Jersey. And I believe you are currently in a position where you cannot afford to give it." He turned and walked out before I could find a retort. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single card with the embossed logo of the Robert Gallery and a check. I stared at the amount. It was exactly what we needed to stop the foreclosure, plus enough to cover my father's medical expenses for a year. It wasn't a gift, it was a hook. It was Vincent Robert showing me that while I might have dignity, he had the world, and he could buy my survival whenever he chose. I spent the rest of the day in a blur of internal conflict. I hated him. I hated the way he had dismantled my life with a few phone calls. But as I watched my father struggle to remember the title of his favorite book, I realized that my pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I dressed in my only professional blazer, pinned my hair back into a tight, severe bun, and stepped into the black sedan that appeared at the curb exactly on time. The ride to Chelsea was silent. The car moved through the city like a shark through dark water, the tinted windows shielding me from the world. When we arrived at the Robert Gallery, the building felt like a fortress. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, cold steel, soaring glass, and an interior so white it hurt the eyes. It was a temple to the new money that was slowly eating the history my father loved. Vincent was waiting in the main hall. The space was empty of people, but filled with art that seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. He was standing before a massive, jagged sculpture of shattered obsidian, his back to me. "You're late," he said, though I knew I wasn't. "I'm here," I countered, walking toward him until I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco that seemed to cling to him. "Why the check, Vincent? If you wanted to ruin me, you've already done a spectacular job. Why pay to see the wreckage?" He turned, and the intensity of his gaze was like a physical blow. He didn't look like the man from the bistro. The coldness was still there, but there was an edge of something else, an intellectual hunger. "I don't care about the wreckage," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I care about the foundation. I did some research on you, Elena. You didn't just drop out of Columbia. You walked away because you refused to let your professor take credit for your work on the Sarpedon crater. You chose obscurity over a compromised legacy. That fascinates me." He began to walk through the gallery, gesturing to the priceless canvases on the walls. "My current director is a sycophant. He tells me what he thinks I want to hear. He sees the price of these pieces, but he doesn't understand their weight. I need someone who understands that art is the only thing that survives us. I need a director who has a spine of iron and a soul that hasn't been bought yet. You already tried to buy me, I pointed out, gesturing to the check in my bag. That wasn't a purchase, Elena. That was an entry fee. You're here because you want to save that bookstore, and I'm here because I want someone in this building who isn't afraid to look me in the eye and tell me when I'm wrong. The position pays 3 times the industry standard. You'll have full autonomy over the acquisitions, provided you follow my lead on the private transactions. I looked at him, searching for the catch. And if I find that your private transactions aren't something I can support? Vincent stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. Then you can leave. But you and I both know you won't. You're a scholar, Elena. You want to be near these pieces as much as I want to own them. We are two of a kind. We both know that the world is a dark place, and we are just trying to find something beautiful enough to make the darkness worth it. I looked around the gallery, at the history, the power, and the terrifying potential of the man standing in front of me. I thought of the final notice and the way my father's hands shook. I'll take the job, I said, my voice steady. But don't expect me to be grateful. Vincent smiled, a sharp, thin expression that didn't reach his flint-colored eyes. Gratefulness is for people who have nothing else to offer. I'm paying for your defiance, Elena. Don't let me down. The first few weeks at the Robert Gallery were a masterclass in the architecture of silence. My office was a minimalist dream of glass and white oak, tucked behind the primary exhibition hall, but it felt more like an observation deck in a high-security bunker. My predecessor had left behind a digital trail of cowardice, files that were perfectly organized on the surface but hollow underneath. As I sat in my ergonomic chair, the hum of the climate control system the only sound, I began to realize that my role was not just to curate beauty, but to act as a decorative veil for the machinery of an empire. I dove into the inventory with the obsessive focus of a woman who had everything to lose. I spent my mornings cataloging the public-facing acquisitions, modernist sculptures from emerging Berlin artists, vibrant abstract expressionist pieces from the Soho underground. These were the distractions, the bright, loud things meant to keep the critics and the socialites occupied. But it was the vault ledger that kept me awake at night. Accessed only through a secondary server that required a biometric scan I hadn't yet been granted, the shadow inventory was a ghost in the machine. I started noticing the discrepancies in the shipping manifests. A crate would arrive from a private port in Malta, listed as containing antique furniture, grade B. But the insurance valuation, tucked away in a sub-file I found by sheer academic stubbornness, was in the millions. These weren't armoires or dining tables. They were vessels. I spent one rainy Tuesday afternoon cross-referencing a specific manifest with a database of looted antiquities from the Middle East. My heart stopped when I saw a match, a set of Sumerian cylinder seals that had disappeared from a regional museum during a period of civil unrest 3 years ago. According to the Robert Gallery's internal logs, they were currently in transit to a private buyer in the Hamptons. You have a habit of digging where the ground is soft, Elena, a voice vibrated from the doorway. I didn't jump, though my pulse spiked. Vincent was leaning against the frame, his tie pulled loose, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked less like a mogul and more like a man who was tired of his own secrets. It's my job to know what's in the building, Vincent, I said, not closing the laptop. I wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid of the truth. These seals, they're red-listed. If the feds get wind that you're moving these, they won't just shut down the gallery. They'll bury you. He walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He set the glass on my desk and leaned over, his face inches from mine. The feds look for people who are clumsy. I am many things, but I am never clumsy. Those seals were being sold to a collector who would have melted them down for the gold content or kept them in a basement where they would rot. By moving them through my network, I'm ensuring they stay intact. I'm a curator of survival, Elena. The law is a blunt instrument, I am a scalpel. You're a smuggler, I whispered, the word hanging in the air between us like a physical weight. I am a facilitator of wealth, he countered. The world is on fire, and the people who start the fires are often the ones who want to save the trophies. I simply charge a premium for the service. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the keys of my laptop. You think your father's bookstore was built on pure intentions? Look at the provenance of his rare folios. Half of them were taken from estates during the Blitz. The world is built on the movement of things that don't belong to the people who have them. You can either be a victim of that history, or you can manage it. He left me there, the smell of his sandalwood cologne lingering like a haunting. I stayed until midnight, staring at the screen. I realized then that the Gallery of Shadows wasn't just a clever name I'd given the place in my head, it was a literal description of how Vincent Roberts saw the world. Everything had a hidden side. As the days turned into a month, my relationship with Vincent began to shift. He started bringing me into the private room, a space behind the vault where the air was even colder and the lighting even dimmer. This was where the real business happened. I watched as he negotiated with men who spoke in low, gravelly voices and women who wore diamonds like armor. I was there to provide the academic cover, to explain the historical significance of a piece to a buyer who only cared about its untraceable value. But I was also doing something else. I was building my own ledger. Every time I touched a piece of blood art, I memorized its markings. Every time a manifest crossed my desk, I noted the port of origin. I was a spy in the house of Robert, waiting for the moment when the golden cage would finally open. I told myself I was doing it for the greater good, but as I looked at the way Vincent's eyes darkened when he talked about the weight of history, I realized I was also doing it because I wanted to see if I could be the one to finally break his stride. One evening, after a particularly high-stakes negotiation for a series of Byzantine icons, Vincent took me to the rooftop of the gallery. The Manhattan skyline was a jagged crown of lights, and the wind was sharp and clean. "Do you hate me yet, Elena?" he asked, looking out over the city. "I don't hate you," I said, and to my horror, I realized it was true. "I hate the world you've chosen to live in. There's so much beauty in these pieces, Vincent. Why does it have to be buried in secrets?" "Because beauty is the only thing people are truly willing to kill for," he said softly. "And I've spent my life making sure I'm the one holding the gun." He turned to look at me then, and for a fleeting second, the monster was gone. There was only a man who looked profoundly alone in his kingdom of shadows. I realized that my martyr complex, the one that told me I had to suffer to save my father, was a mirror of his own obsession with control. We were both trapped, just in different types of cages. The transition from the world of a bustling bistro to the hushed, velvet-lined corridors of the Robert Gallery was more than a change of scenery, it was a total recalibration of my senses. In the restaurant, the air had been thick with the scent of garlic, expensive wine, and the frantic energy of the dinner rush. Here, the air was a constant, sterile 68 degrees, filtered of all impurities, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old secrets. My first month as director had been a blur of learning the high-stakes theater of the art world. I watched how Vincent used silence like a weapon, how he would let a prospective buyer sweat for 3 minutes before uttering a single, devastating sentence that would triple the price of a canvas. I had spent years studying the brushstrokes of the masters, but I was now learning the brushstrokes of power. Every morning, I arrived at the gallery before the sun had fully cleared the skyscrapers of the east side, relishing the quiet moments when the marble floors were still polished to a mirror shine and the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of my heels. I had moved into a new apartment, paid for by the signing bonus, that had also cleared my father's medical debts and secured a private nurse for him 3 days a week. The bookstore was safe, the bank's wolves had been called off, but I felt more precarious than ever. The first crack in the facade occurred on a Tuesday night in late November. The city was gripped by a sudden, brutal cold snap that turned the Hudson into a churning mess of slate and white. Vincent had called me into the sub-basement vault, the heart of the gallery, to inspect a new shipment that had arrived via a private courier from Istanbul. The vault was a masterpiece of security engineering. 3 layers of reinforced steel, biometric scanners, and a localized fire suppression system that would suck the oxygen out of the room in seconds to protect the treasures within. Inside, it felt like being at the center of the world. Rows of flat file drawers held sketches by Caravaggio and Da Vinci. Freestanding pedestals supported Roman busts and Egyptian statuary that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. This came from a private estate in the Bayukada, Vincent said, gesturing to a large, wooden crate that had been meticulously pried open. Inside, wrapped in layers of acid-free paper, was a collection of Byzantine icons. They were breathtaking. The gold leaf shimmered in the harsh LED lighting, and the eyes of the saints were wide and haunting, filled with an ancient, silent sorrow. But as I leaned in closer, my magnifying loupe in hand, I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the climate control. "Vincent," I whispered, my fingers hovering just an inch above the wood of the oldest icon. "These aren't from a private estate." "Does it matter?" he asked, standing behind me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold of the vault. "It matters to the monastery they were chiseled out of," I said, turning to face him. I pointed to the jagged, unfinished edges of the wood at the bottom of the piece. This was hacked from a wall. "These aren't trade items, they're trophies. This is blood art, Vincent. You're moving pieces that were stolen during the unrest last summer." He didn't look away. Instead, he stepped closer, forcing me back against the heavy steel table. "The world is a graveyard, Elena. These pieces would have been burned for warmth or used as target practice by the militias. I rescued them. You bought them from the people who stole them," I countered, my voice rising. "You're funding the very conflict that puts these pieces at risk. Is that your philosophy? To profit from the destruction of history so you can keep the pieces in a dark room where no one can see them?" The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on us from the walls of the vault. I expected him to snap, to remind me of the check he'd written or the blacklist he could reinstate with a single text. Instead, he did something far more terrifying. He sat down on a low stool, his shoulders slumping, and for the first time, he looked his age. "My father didn't build this to love art," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the hum of the vault. "He built it because he was a man who grew up with nothing in the ruins of post-war Berlin. He realized that the people who held the history were the ones who held the future. He taught me that if you don't own it, you're at the mercy of those who do." He looked up at the Byzantine icon, the gold reflecting in his eyes. "He used to make me stand in the rain for hours to pardon me. He told me that feeling was a liability. When you threw those $2 at me in the street, Elena, for a second, I wasn't the man in the charcoal suit. I was the boy in the rain. You were the only person in 10 years who looked at me and didn't see a bank account. You saw a man. Even if you hated him, you saw him." The vulnerability was like a physical blow. I had prepared myself for his anger, for his ruthlessness, but I wasn't prepared for his humanity. My hand, still holding the loupe, trembled. I saw the monster flicker, revealing a hollowed-out center that all the money in the world couldn't fill. "You don't have to be the boy in the rain anymore, Vincent," I said softly. He reached out, his hand covering mine on the cold steel table. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Then tell me how to be someone else, Elena. Because I don't know the way out of this room." The intimacy was sudden and suffocating. In the heart of his secret empire, surrounded by the stolen history of a dozen nations, the lines between us blurred. I wasn't just his director, and he wasn't just my benefactor. We were two broken people trying to figure out if we could build something whole out of the wreckage. But the moment was shattered. The internal security phone on the wall began to blare a sharp, staccato alarm. Vincent was up in an instant, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of iron as he crossed the room to the monitors. "What is it?" I asked, my heart hammering. "A breach at the perimeter," he said, his eyes scanning the flickering black and white feeds. "The Morettas. They aren't waiting for the gala." He grabbed a sleek, black handset from a hidden compartment and began barking orders to the security team. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. The crack in the door just became a canyon, "Elena. Stay in the vault. Do not open it for anyone but me." As the heavy door hissed shut and the locks engaged with a series of deep, metallic thuds, I was left alone with the saints and the gold. I looked at the Byzantine icons, their haunting eyes staring back at me, and I realized that the immoral quagmire I had feared was no longer a theoretical problem. The war had come to our doorstep, and I was trapped in the center of the vault with the man who had started it. The gala was supposed to be the moment the Robert Gallery transitioned from a private fortress to a public landmark, but the air inside the grand ballroom was thick with a tension that no amount of expensive catering could mask. I stood near the marble staircase, dressed in a floor-length gown of midnight silk that Vincent had sent to my office earlier that afternoon. It felt less like a garment and more like a uniform, armor for a war I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to fight. The room was a sea of New York's most dangerous egos. Moguls, politicians, and socialites drifted through the exhibits, their laughter tinkling like breaking glass over the low hum of a string quartet. But beneath the surface, the gallery of shadows was operating at full capacity. I saw the way Vincent's security detail moved, men with hollow eyes and bulges beneath their tuxedo jackets, and I realized that every guest in the room was being appraised not for their net worth, but for their threat level. Vincent was the sun around which the entire room orbited. He looked magnificent and monstrous all at once, his charcoal suit replaced by a black tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. He caught my eye from across the room and inclined his head, a silent acknowledgement of the secret we had shared in the vault nights before. I felt a traitorous pull toward him, a desire to be part of that strength, even as my conscience screamed at the blood on the canvases surrounding us. "You look like you're waiting for a ghost," a voice whispered near my ear. I turned to see Julian Moretti, the youngest scion of the rival family that had been circling Vincent's empire for months. He was handsome in a way that felt oily, his smile too wide and his eyes too hungry. "I'm just admiring the art, Mr. Moretti," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Is that what we're calling it tonight?" He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive gin and malice radiating from him. "My family has a long memory, Elena. We remember when this gallery was a warehouse for the things people wanted to forget. Vincent thinks he can paint over the past with a few philanthropy checks, but the foundation is still rotten." Before I could respond, the lights didn't just flicker, they died with a heavy, mechanical groan that echoed through the 40-foot ceilings. The silence that followed lasted only a second, a sharp intake of breath from 300 people, before the first explosion shattered the north skylight. Shards of reinforced glass rained down like diamonds, followed by the rhythmic, terrifying thud of flashbang grenades. The quartet stopped mid-note, replaced by a symphony of screams and the staccato bark of suppressed gunfire. "Down!" Vincent's voice boomed over the chaos. He appeared out of the smoke like a vengeful god, his hand gripping my arm with bruising force as he shoved me behind a pedestal holding a Roman bust. The businessman was gone. In his place was a man who moved with a tactical lethality that was horrifying to behold. He pulled a sleek, matte black handgun from an ankle holster, his eyes scanning the balcony where shadows were descending on ropes. "They're not here for the guests," Vincent hissed, his breath hot against my temple. "They're here for the vault keys. They want the ledger you found, Elena. They want the map to everything." I watched, frozen, as the ballroom became a tactical nightmare. This wasn't a robbery, it was an assassination of an empire. Vincent's men engaged the Moretti hit squad with a cold efficiency that told me they had been expecting this. Blood sprayed across a pristine white canvas, a Jackson Pollock lookalike now decorated with a more visceral kind of abstract art. "I have to get to the server room," I whispered, the adrenaline finally overriding the terror. "If I can lock down the biometric overrides from the main console, they can't open the vault even with the keys." Vincent looked at me, a flash of something that might have been pride, or fear, crossing his face. "Go. Take the service stairs. I'll draw their fire toward the south wing." I ran. I tore the hem of my silk gown so I could move, my bare feet slapping against the cold marble as I sprinted through the darkened corridors. The gallery, once so elegant, was now a labyrinth of terror. I could hear the echoes of boots on the floors above me and the muffled sounds of the struggle in the ballroom. I reached the server room, my fingers trembling as I punched in the emergency codes. On the monitors, I saw the full extent of the monster Vincent truly was. He wasn't just defending his property, he was hunting. He moved through the shadows of the secondary gallery, taking down attackers with a cold-blooded precision that made my stomach churn. He didn't just stop them, he neutralized them with a finality that spoke of a man who had long ago traded his soul for survival. As I bypassed the biometric locks, I saw a folder on the main screen I hadn't noticed before, Operation Palindrome. I clicked it, and my breath hitched. It was a list of every piece of art in the gallery, but with a second set of coordinates, not for buyers, but for the original sites of excavation. Vincent hadn't just been smuggling art, he had been tracking its return path. He had been building a map for a future he didn't think he was allowed to have. The door to the server room kicked open. I didn't look up. I knew it was the end. But it wasn't a Moretti soldier. It was Vincent, his tuxedo torn, blood matting the hair at his temple. He looked at the screen, then at me. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his voice raw. "You were going to send them back," I said, my voice shaking. "All of them." "In time," he said, stepping toward me. "But time just ran out. We have to go, Elena. The police are 5 minutes out, and the Morettis won't leave witnesses to their failure." As we fled into the night, the gallery burning behind us, I realized that the blood and canvas wasn't just about the gala. It was about the messy, violent birth of something new. I had seen the monster, but I had also seen the architect. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, I knew I was no longer just an observer. I was the keeper of the map. The aftermath of the gala felt like the cooling of a fever dream, leaving behind a city that was darker and far more fragile than it had been hours before. While the smoke still curled from the scorched marble of the main hall, we were sequestered in the penthouse of one of Vincent's ghost buildings, a brutalist spire of glass that offered a panoramic view of the Hudson. Vincent sat in the shadows of the living area, his shirt unbuttoned, a doctor silently stitching the gash along his shoulder. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a man who had survived a crash and was waiting for the ground to stop shaking. I sat at a mahogany desk in the corner, the laptop from the server room humming under my fingers. My hands were finally steady, but my mind was a storm. I had the ledger. I had the hidden ledger that contained every sin the Robert family had committed over 3 decades, but I also had Operation Palindrome. As the doctor packed his kit and slipped out, leaving us in a silence so thick it felt like a physical presence, I began my secret counterplay. I wasn't just looking at the files, I was rewriting them. I was a brilliant academic dropout, and I knew how to bury data where only those looking for it could find it. I spent the night creating a dead man switch, a digital failsafe that would release the entire history of the gallery to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the world if something happened to me. Or if Vincent decided the monster was the only version of himself that could survive. "What are you doing, Elena?" His voice drifted from the shadows. It was gravelly, stripped of its usual veneer of control. "Securing our future," I said, not looking up. "The Morettis failed to take the physical ledger, but they'll try to hack the cloud next. I'm moving the assets into a decentralized network. Even you won't be able to access the full list without my authorization." Vincent stood up, his movement stiff. He walked toward me, the amber city lights reflecting in his eyes. He leaned over the desk, his presence as suffocating as it had been that first night in the rain. "You're taking my keys away from me." "I'm giving you a conscience, Vincent. There's a difference." I turned the screen toward him. I looked at Palindrome. I saw the coordinates. "You've spent millions tracking the origin points of the pieces you've acquired. You weren't just laundering money, you were hoarding the map for their return. Why? Why keep the way back home secret?" He looked at the screen, and for a moment, the flint in his eyes cracked. "Because as long as I have the map, I have the power to decide when the world gets its history back. It was my only leverage. If I gave it away, I'd just be another man with a pile of blood money and no soul left to buy it back with." "You don't buy a soul back, Vincent," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You earn it." I showed him what I had done. I had begun the secret counterplay, not to destroy him, but to force his hand. I had linked the Robert Gallery's logistical network, the very ships and planes that moved the stolen art, to a series of international nonprofits. The system was now rigged so that every legitimate sale would subsidize the quiet return of a red-listed item. We were no longer just a gallery, we were becoming a clandestine museum of restoration. "You've compromised the entire operation," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. Only a profound, weary realization. "I've optimized it," I countered. "The Morettas want a war over shadows. Let them have the shadows. We're moving into the light. But if you try to stop me, if you try to revert to the old ways, the ledger goes live. You'll go to prison, the gallery will be seized, and everything you've saved will be auctioned off by the government to the highest bidder, probably the same people you stole them from." Vincent reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of my jaw. It was a gesture that was half threat, half caress. "You really are a martyr, aren't you? You'd burn your own life down just to make sure I don't win the wrong way." "I'm not a martyr, Vincent. I'm an appraiser. And I've decided that your life is worth more than your ledger." He didn't pull away. The silence of the penthouse was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a pact. We were tied together now, bound by a digital tether and a shared secret that was more dangerous than any crime he had ever committed. I was his director, his partner, and his jailer. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the New York skyline in shades of bruised purple and gold, I felt the shift in the room. The hidden ledger was no longer a weapon to be used against him, it was the blueprint for our shared survival. I had the proof of his crimes, but I also had the evidence of his potential. "The Morettas will come again," Vincent said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "They won't stop until they see me dead or the ledger in their hands. Then we'll give them what they want," I said, a cold, calculated plan beginning to form in my mind. "We'll give them a version of the truth that destroys them, while we use the real truth to change the world." The war wasn't over, but the rules had changed. I was no longer the girl chasing a car in the rain. I was the architect of a new legacy, and for the first time, Vincent Robert was the one following my lead. The penthouse was a cage of glass, and as the days bled into a week, the air inside felt increasingly thin. The Morettas had gone underground, a move that Vincent warned was far more dangerous than an open assault. They were suffocating his assets, freezing his offshore accounts through corrupted officials, and making it clear that the Robert Empire was being systematically dismantled. Vincent paced the perimeter of the room like a caged panther, his phone a constant source of bad news. The monster was close to the surface now, his eyes dark with a cold, murderous intent that made even the seasoned security guards keep their distance. I sat at the center of the room, my laptop open, watching the digital walls close in. I knew that if he snapped, he would revert to the old ways, violence, retribution, and a deeper dive into the darkness that had birthed his power. I couldn't let that happen. Not after what I had discovered in Operation Palindrome. "They hit the transport in Marseille," Vincent said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He slammed a hand against the reinforced glass. 3 men dead. They didn't even take the crates. They just burned them. They're not trying to steal from me anymore, Elena. They're trying to erase me. Then let them, I said, my voice calm, cutting through his mounting fury. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief. Let them? They are burning history to get to me. They are destroying everything I've spent my life protecting. You aren't protecting it, Vincent. You're hoarding it. I stood up, the weight of the hidden ledger on the drive in my pocket feeling like a physical anchor. This is the moment. This is the crossroads. You can go back to the mud and fight them like a criminal, or you can use this crisis to burn the bridges yourself. I walked toward him, stopping only when I was inches away. The tension between us was an electric hum, a proximity that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Here is the ultimatum, Vincent. I've already pre-recorded a statement. I've mapped the logistics. We announce that the Robert Gallery is closing its private vaults. We turn over the evidence of the Moretti's smuggling to the authorities, along with a full, curated confession of your own past involvements. You're asking me to go to prison, he hissed. I'm asking you to buy your freedom with the truth. We negotiate a deal. You return the assets in Operation Palindrome, you provide the testimony to take down the Morettas and the rest of the syndicate, and you transition the Robert name into a non-profit foundation. You lose the money. You lose the might makes right philosophy. But you keep your life. And you keep me. The silence that followed was deafening. I was offering him a path to redemption that required him to destroy everything his father had taught him to value. He looked at me, his gaze searching mine for any sign of hesitation. He saw none. I was the girl in the rain again, holding the $2, refusing to move. And if I say no, he asked, his voice a whisper. Then I walk out that door. I take the ledger to the district attorney tonight. You'll be arrested by morning, the Morettas will kill you in your cell, and your father's name will be a footnote in a crime report. I won't watch you become the monster just to survive a war you should never have started. Vincent reached out, his hand gripping the back of my neck, pulling me forward until our foreheads touched. His breath was shaky, the first sign of true fear I had ever seen from him. It wasn't fear of death, it was the fear of losing the only mirror that showed him a version of himself he actually liked. You're a terrifying woman, Elena Jersey, he whispered. I'm a woman who knows what you're worth, I replied. Now, choose. He closed his eyes, and for a long minute, the only sound was the wind howling against the glass. When he opened them, the flint was gone. There was only a profound, quiet exhaustion. Call your contacts, he said. Burn the bridges. But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. We don't just give them the truth. We use the truth to bury the Morettas so deep they never see the sun again. I felt the air rush back into my lungs. The golden cage hadn't just opened, we had dismantled it from the inside. But as I reached for the phone to begin the transition, a flash of red light erupted from the building across the street. Sniper! Vincent roared, lunging for me. The glass that was supposed to be unbreakable shattered in a spiderweb of cracks as a high-caliber round whistled through the air. The ultimatum was over. The siege had begun. The sound of the first shot wasn't a crack, it was a heavy, visceral thrum that resonated in the marrow of my bones. The supposedly impenetrable glass of the penthouse didn't shatter into shards but blossomed into a white, opaque spiderweb where the kinetic energy had spent itself. Vincent's weight slammed into me, driving the air from my lungs as he tackled me to the hardwood floor. We skidded together into the shadow of the mahogany desk just as a second round whistled through the breach, punching a hole through a multi-million-dollar sculpture behind us. The siege wasn't a distant threat anymore, it was a physical presence in the room. Stay down. Vincent commanded, his voice no longer the polished baritone of a businessman but the jagged, guttural growl of a man who had spent his youth in the dirt. The lights in the penthouse flickered and died as the building's primary power was cut from the street level. In the sudden, bruised darkness of the New York twilight, the red dots of laser sights began to dance across the walls like fireflies from hell. The Morettas weren't interested in the ledger anymore. They had realized that as long as Vincent Robert was breathing, he was a threat to their existence. They were here to liquidate the firm and the man. They're on the roof, I whispered, the adrenaline making my teeth chatter. I could hear the rhythmic, metallic clink of grappling hooks catching the edge of the terrace. I know, Vincent said. He reached into the hidden compartment beneath the desk and pulled out two items, a tactical headset and a secondary handgun. He checked the magazine with a practiced, terrifying flick of his wrist. He looked at me, his eyes catching the faint glow of the city lights. Elena, listen to me. This isn't a gallery. This is a kill box. You have the drive? I patted the pocket of my blazer, feeling the hard edges of the flash drive, the digital soul of the Robert Empire. I have it. Good. Because that's the only thing that's going to keep you alive if I don't. He shoved the tactical headset into my hand. Channel 4. My security team is being squeezed on the ground floor, but I have a bird inbound to the helipad. You have to get to the roof. Not without you, I said, my voice cracking but firm. The first of the terrace doors exploded inward. The Moretti hit squad moved with the silent, fluid grace of professional assassins. Vincent didn't hesitate. He rose from behind the desk, a shadow among shadows, and opened fire. The room erupted in a chaotic symphony of muzzle flashes and the sharp, ozone smell of cordite. I watched, paralyzed, as the man I had tried to save became the instrument of destruction he was born to be. He didn't just fire, he navigated the room like a ghost, using the furniture and the pillars as a shield, his movements a brutal dance of survival. Go! Now, he roared over the din. I ran. I didn't head for the elevator, that would be a vertical coffin. I sprinted for the service stairs, the heavy door clanging shut behind me, momentarily muffling the sounds of the war in the penthouse. The stairwell was a concrete throat, echoing with the sound of my own frantic breathing and the distant, muffled thuds of explosions below. My bare feet bled against the cold concrete. I'd lost my shoes in the scramble, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the weight of the drive and the terrifying image of Vincent standing alone against the dark. I reached the roof just as the sky opened up. The rain was back, a freezing New York deluge that turned the helipad into a slick, dangerous plateau. The wind howled through the steel girders, and for a second, I felt utterly alone. Then, the shadow of the helicopter appeared, its rotors cutting through the rain like the heartbeat of a giant. Elena. I turned to see Vincent stumbling through the rooftop door. He was clutching his side, his white shirt stained a deep, visceral crimson. Behind him, 3 men emerged from the stairwell. Vincent! I screamed. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have his training. But I had the flare gun I'd snatched from the emergency kit in the stairwell. I didn't think, I acted on pure, primal instinct. I leveled the plastic orange barrel and pulled the trigger. The flare erupted in a blinding, crimson scream of light, catching the lead assassin directly in the chest. The brilliance was so intense it bleached the world white for a heartbeat. In that moment of distraction, Vincent found his second wind. He pivoted, his handgun barking 3 times in rapid succession. The remaining men fell back into the shadows of the stairwell as the helicopter touched down, its skid sparking against the wet concrete. The pilot roared for us to move. Vincent collapsed against me, his weight nearly taking us both down. I wrapped his arm over my shoulder, my fingers digging into the soaked silk of his jacket, and hauled him toward the open door of the Bird. We tumbled onto the floor of the cabin just as the helicopter lurched into the sky, banking hard over the Hudson. I looked down at the penthouse. It was a glowing ember in the New York skyline, a monument to a world that was currently burning to the ground. Vincent lay on the floor, his eyes fluttering, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. I knelt beside him, pressing my hands against the wound in his side, the warm blood seeping through my fingers. We did it, he whispered, a ghostly smile touching his lips. We're not done yet, I said, tears finally spilling over as the adrenaline crashed. You still have to pay me for the overtime. He reached up, his hand trembling as he touched the flash drive in my pocket. The map. Elena. The map home. Use it. As the helicopter carried us away from the ruins of the Robert Empire, I realized that the siege hadn't just destroyed his past, it had cleared the ground for a future neither of us could have imagined in the rain outside the bistro. The predator was broken, but for the first time in his life, he was finally free. The transition from the ruins of the Robert Empire to the birth of the Robert Jersey Foundation was not a sudden pivot, but a slow, agonizing reconstruction of 2 lives that had been forged in fire. For 6 months, the world knew only the headlines, the sensational fall of a billionaire, the dismantling of a massive international smuggling ring, and the mysterious whistleblower who had turned the keys over to the Department of Justice. But inside the sterile, high-security wing of a private hospital, and later within the quiet, book-lined walls of our new headquarters, the real story was being written in ink and sweat. Vincent had survived the night on the helipad, though the monster he used to be did not. The man who emerged from the surgeries was leaner, quieter, and carried himself with the stillness of someone who had seen the bottom of the abyss and decided not to live there. We spent those months in a whirlwind of legal depositions and tactical cooperation. With the hidden ledger as our shield and my academic expertise as the guide, we systematically dismantled the Moretti family's reach, trading Vincent's testimony for a radical, unprecedented leniency the total forfeiture of his criminal assets to fund a global repatriation network. 1 year to the day after the siege, I stood in the lobby of the new Robert Jersey Foundation in Dumbo. The space was a far cry from the cold, sterile glass of the Chelsea Gallery. This was a place of light and warmth, housed in a converted 19th century warehouse where the original brickwork was exposed and the air smelled of floor wax and old paper. It was open to the public, a living, breathing museum where the art didn't sit in vaults, but waited in crates to be shipped back to the soil from which it was stolen. I walked through the processing wing, where teams of historians and forensic specialists were meticulously cataloging the items from Operation Palindrome. We were no longer moving, blood-stained assets, we were healing the wounds of history. I saw a young intern carefully wrapping the Byzantine icons we had once stood over in the dark of the vault. They were going back to the monastery in Istanbul next week. The saint's eyes no longer looked haunting to me, they looked expectant. The board is concerned about the logistics for the Parthenon shipment, a voice said behind me. I turned to see Vincent. He looked different, the charcoal suits were gone, replaced by a simple navy blazer and an open collar. The flint-gray eyes were still sharp, but the predatory edge had been replaced by a focused, relentless purpose. He looked like a man who had finally found a way to use his ruthlessness for something that didn't leave a stain. The board is always concerned, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. Tell them that if we can move a 3-ton statue through a war zone in a storm, we can handle a diplomatic handoff in Athens. I told them exactly that, he said, walking toward me. They didn't believe me until I mentioned that you were the one overseeing the crates. Apparently, your reputation for being difficult has become our greatest asset. He followed me into my office, a room that mirrored my father's bookstore, overflowing with reference texts, maps, and the comforting clutter of a life dedicated to truth. My father, Arthur, had been moved into a beautiful assisted living suite just 3 blocks away. His mind was still drifting, but he was safe, he was happy, and he had finally stopped asking if we got the shipment of Keats in. He knew I had saved the books. Vincent stopped in front of the wall behind my desk. There, in a frame of simple, elegant black wood, sat the 2 crumpled $1 bills that had started everything. They were no longer a symbol of a billionaire's insult or a waitress's desperation. They were the cornerstone of the entire foundation. I still think you overcharged me for that dinner, Elena, Vincent said softly, his hand brushing the glass of the frame. It was a high-risk investment, Vincent, I replied, leaning against the desk. But I'd say the returns have been significant. He turned to me, and for the first time in our long, complicated history, there was no shadow between us. No ledgers, no secrets, no golden cages. There was just the work, the legacy, and the man who had walked through the rain to find his soul. I never thanked you, he said, his voice dropping to a low, sincere register. For chasing the car. For not letting me stay in the rain. You paid me in the only currency that matters, Vincent, I said, reaching out to take his hand. You gave me the chance to prove that some things are truly priceless. Outside the window, the New York sun was setting, casting a long, golden glow over the city. It wasn't the bruised, violent purple of the night of the siege. It was a clear, brilliant light that illuminated the path forward. We stood together, the architect and the appraiser, looking out at a world that was a little bit brighter because one woman had refused to swallow an insult. The $2 war was over. The era of the new legacy had begun, and as we walked out of the office together, the sound of the city wasn't a roar of predators, it was the hum of a world being put back together, one piece at a time. She didn't just return the money, she dismantled his world. If you think Elena's move was a masterstroke, hit the subscribe/follow button to see how the $2 war ends. What would you have done if Vincent Robert left that tip on your tray? Let's talk in the comments.